The morning they brought Jane Leland to Dexter Stone like she was a piece of furniture to be traded. The sun was just cresting the red bluffs east of Coldwater Creek, and something about the way that light fell across the dust told her this day would change everything she had ever known. She stood between two of her father's ranch hands on the wooden porch of the Coldwater Creek land office, wearing her second-best dress because her father had told her to look presentable, not like she was going to a celebration. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She had not been crying, and she refused to begin now. Thomas Leland had raised her on a failing cattle ranch with the kind of stubborn dignity that comes from poverty trying its best to look like something else. And whatever else Jane Leland was, she was her father's daughter. She did not cry in front of strangers. She had heard the whole arrangement the night before, pressed against the thin wall between the parlor and the hallway, her ear against the cold pine boards while her father's voice carried through. He owed Dexter Stone $2,000 in back payments on the northern parcel of grazing land, the land that sat between the Leland cattle range and the water access that kept the whole operation alive. Without that water access, the ranch died. Without the ranch, Thomas Leland was nothing, and he believed his daughter was nothing without a husband to give her the respectability the frontier demanded of unmarried women who were no longer 18. Jane was 22. In her father's arithmetic, that made her a liability. The arrangement, as her father had explained it to the two ranch hands who would escort her, was this: the debt of $2,000 would be forgiven. The land title would remain with Dexter Stone, but the water rights passage would be transferred permanently to Leland cattle. In exchange, Jane Leland would marry Dexter Stone before the end of October. It was September the 3rd, 1878. She had not slept. Dexter Stone arrived at the land office at 8 in the morning, which was the time that had been agreed upon. Jane heard him before she saw him, boots on the dry boards of the main street, a measured pace, not rushed but not slow. She turned from where she had been looking at the distant bluffs, and her first impression of him was that he was not what she had expected. She had constructed a man in her imagination during the sleepless night, someone older and rough in a way that had nothing gentle in it, someone with hungry eyes and a dismissive mouth. The man who stepped up to the porch of the land office was perhaps 29 or 30, broad across the shoulders but lean, with dark hair under a plain brown hat that had seen considerable weather. His face was not unkind. That surprised her more than anything. Thomas Leland was already inside with the land agent, a man named Percy Hollis, who had the nervous energy of someone who understood that what was happening was not entirely decent, but had convinced himself that frontier practicalities excused most things. Thomas came to the door when he heard Stone arrive, and the two men shook hands with the practiced ease of a transaction already decided. "Mr. Stone," Thomas said, "this is my daughter, Jane." Dexter Stone turned and looked at her, and Jane Leland met his eyes with the directness she had always used as her primary defense against a world that wanted her to look down. His eyes were a dark gray, the color of storm clouds when they are still considering their options. He did not look at her the way she had feared he would. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they are trying to understand. "Miss Leland," he said. His voice was even, quiet but full enough to carry. "Mr. Stone," she said. Thomas Leland gestured toward the door. Come inside, Percy has the papers ready." They filed into the land office, which smelled of ink and old wood and the particular mustiness of filed documents. Percy Hollis had spread the paperwork across his wide oak desk, and there were two chairs arranged in front of it, clearly intended for Thomas Leland and Dexter Stone. Jane stood to the side. She had not been given a chair because it had not occurred to anyone that she would need one. Percy began his recitation of the terms with the solemnity of a man who has decided formality makes difficult things acceptable. The northern parcel, the water rights, the debt forgiveness, and then his voice shifted, lower, more careful as he reached the final condition. The marriage arrangement, to be formalized within 60 days. Jane Elaine Leland to be joined in matrimony with Dexter Calvin Stone, the union serving as the concluding settlement of all financial and property obligations between the two parties. Dexter Stone had been sitting with his arms resting on the chair, his hat on his knee, listening with a face that gave nothing away. When Percy finished reading that last section, there was a silence that stretched past comfortable and kept going. Then Dexter Stone said, "Read that last part again." Percy looked up. "Pardon? The last condition. Read it again." Percy looked at Thomas Leland, who shifted his weight in his chair but said nothing. Percy read it again. Dexter Stone stood. He did not do it with heat or drama, but with a deliberateness that made the air in the room feel different. He picked up his hat, turned it once in his hands, and looked at Thomas Leland. "You brought your daughter here," Dexter said, "as collateral." Thomas Leland had the decency to look uncomfortable. "It is a practical arrangement. Jane needs a good situation, and I need the land payment," Dexter said. "That is what I need. I don't need your daughter, Mr. Leland, and she doesn't need to be handed to a man like she's a parcel of acreage with feet." He paused. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do." He looked at Percy Hollis. "You'll note this in whatever record you keep. I'm handing back the northern parcel to Leland. The debt is forgiven. The water rights passage is granted to Leland cattle in perpetuity, no conditions attached." He looked at Thomas again. "And your daughter goes where she chooses." The silence this time was a different kind. Jane Leland felt the breath go out of her as though she had been holding it since the night before, since she had pressed her ear to that cold pine wall and heard her future being decided without her. She looked at Dexter Stone, and he was already looking at her, and there was something in his expression that was not pity, because she would have turned away from pity. It was something closer to respect, and it landed on her chest like warmth. Thomas Leland sputtered. "Now see here, Stone, we had an agreement. We had a discussion," Dexter said. "I never put my signature to this version of it. Your daughter's name should not be in a land contract, and you know it." Thomas stood, and for a moment his pride and his shame fought each other across his face, and it was not entirely clear which one would win. "She has nowhere to go," he said, and his voice was lower now, and there was something in it that was almost grief, the grief of a man who has reduced something precious to a transaction and is only now understanding what he has done. "She has no money." She can make her own accounting of what she has," Dexter said. He turned to Jane, and the directness of it caught her off guard all over again. "Miss Leland, I'm sorry this was done to you. I didn't know it would be like this when I agreed to meet here today. I thought this was a land discussion." He paused. "You don't owe me anything. You don't owe your father anything that involves your freedom. Whatever you decide to do next, that's your decision to make." Jane looked at him for a long moment. The morning light came through the single window of the land office and fell across the dusty floor. Outside, Coldwater Creek's Main Street was beginning its daily noise, a wagon somewhere, a dog's distant bark, the ordinary sounds of a place that had not noticed that something extraordinary was happening inside this small office. "Thank you, Mr. Stone," Jane said. Her voice was steady. She was her father's daughter, and she was more than that, and her voice was steady. She walked out of the land office. She stood on the porch and breathed the morning air, which smelled of dust and sagebrush, and the faint sweetness of something blooming somewhere she could not see. The bluffs were fully lit now, that particular orange red that only came in the early part of the day, and the sky above them was the clean blue of a promise. Jane Leland was 22 years old. She had approximately $4.30 in the small leather purse she carried. She had the dress she was wearing and one trunk of belongings back at her father's ranch, and she was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, entirely her own. She did not know what to do with that yet. She sat down on the wooden bench outside the land office and watched the street. A woman named Clara Ashworth, who ran the town's dry goods store with her husband, walked past and nodded. Two men on horses moved at a walk down the center of the street. A boy chased a chicken with the dedicated enthusiasm of someone who had been assigned this task and taken it seriously. The door of the land office opened and Dexter Stone came out. He pulled his hat on and then seemed to notice her sitting there, and he stopped. There was a brief pause where neither of them spoke. "You're still here," he said, not accusingly, just noticing. "I'm deciding," she said. He nodded at that, as though deciding was a legitimate activity that deserved its own time. He moved to the porch railing and leaned against it, looking out at the street. Somewhere behind them, inside the office, her father and Percy Hollies were presumably dealing with the paperwork of Dexter's extraordinary decision. "You gave up $2,000, Jane said. She was not accusing him either. She was just accounting for things. "I did," he said, "and you gave up the northern parcel." "I gave it back. It was your father's to begin with." Jane looked at him sideways. "That's a significant thing to do for a stranger." "Putting a woman in a land contract is a significant injustice," he said. He said it simply, without grandstanding. "I wasn't going to be part of that." She studied his profile. The jaw, the nose that had clearly been broken at some point and healed slightly crooked, the dark stubble that was perhaps 2 days past clean-shaven. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the street with the ease of someone who does not need to be watched. "Where do you live?" she asked. He glanced at her. "About 12 miles northwest of here. I have a ranch. It's called Stone Creek, which is not me being poetic about my name. It's just what the creek there has always been called." There was the smallest edge of something in his voice when he said that last part, a dry humor, carefully contained. Jane almost smiled. "How big a ranch?" "Big enough to run well and small enough to run honestly," he said. She did look at the street this time, alongside him, and they were both quiet for a moment that was not uncomfortable. Out in the world before her were the full weight of her circumstances. No money, no husband, no plan, no place that was properly hers. And somehow, sitting next to this man she had known for less than an hour, she did not feel the desperate, clawing panic she had expected to feel. "Mr. Stone," she said, "do you need anyone at Stone Creek? In any legitimate capacity, cooking or keeping the books or anything of that kind?" He turned and looked at her fully now, and she met his eyes again the way she had when he first arrived, directly and without apology. "You're asking me for work," he said. "I'm asking you if there's work available," she said. "That's different. If there isn't, I'll ask somewhere else." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, actually thinking, not dismissing. "My housekeeper left in June," he said. "Married a man in Tucson. I've been eating badly since." He paused. "The ranch accounts are kept by a man in town who charges me $4 a month for the privilege of making mistakes. I think you could do better than him." "I kept my father's accounts for 4 years, Jane said. "He didn't thank me for it, but the numbers were right." "They usually are," Dexter said, "when the person doing them actually understands what they're looking at." They looked at each other. The morning was fully arrived now, bright and clear, and Coldwater Creek was going about its business without knowing anything had changed. "I'd pay you a fair wage," he said. "There would be a proper room. No obligation beyond the work. You'd be free to leave whenever you chose." "That's all I need to hear," Jane said, and she stood from the bench and straightened her dress and looked at him with the clear-eyed steadiness that was her particular signature. "When would you like to start?" he asked. "I'd like to go back to the ranch and collect my trunk," she said. "I can be at Stone Creek by afternoon." He nodded. "I'll be there." She walked away from the porch and into the brightness of the morning, and she did not look back. But she was aware of him standing at the railing watching her go, and the awareness was not unpleasant. It was the particular awareness of being seen by someone who actually looked. The ride back to her father's ranch was quiet. Thomas Leland had come out of the land office by the time she arranged transport with a man she knew who was heading out that direction, and they had not spoken, but her father's face had carried the complicated map of a man who knew he had done wrong, and was not yet ready to fully arrive at apology. Jane had not helped him arrive. She had simply collected what she needed and said goodbye to the cook, a Navajo woman named Dora who had worked for her father for 6 years, and who had always treated Jane with the matter-of-fact kindness of someone who did not need a reason to be decent. Dora had pressed Jane's hands between her warm, rough ones and looked at her steadily. "You are going somewhere good," Dora said, which was not a question. "I believe so," Jane had said. The wagon ride northwest was 12 miles of red dirt road through country that opened and widened as it went, the scrub cedar and pinon giving way to longer grasslands, the kind of country that seemed to breathe. By the time Stone Creek came into view, the sun had moved past noon and was working its way toward afternoon, and the light was honey-colored and full of the particular richness of a September day that knows summer is leaving. Stone Creek Ranch was not what she had imagined when she heard the word ranch, which in her experience meant her father's place, a collection of buildings that had been fixed and refixed so many times they were more repair than original. Dexter Stone's ranch was simple but solid, a main house built in good timber and stone with a long covered porch running the front of it, a barn that was genuinely square, a bunkhouse with a straight roof line, corrals that were tight and even. Everything had the look of being done once and done correctly, which matched something she had already begun to understand about the man who owned it. He was at the barn when she arrived, unsaddling a horse, and he came out to help her with the trunk without being asked. He showed her to the room that would be hers, a room on the east side of the house with a window that looked toward the creek and its line of cottonwoods. It was not large, but it had a good bed and a chest of drawers, and a small desk that seemed to have been put there by someone who thought the person in this room might want to write things down. Jane touched the desk lightly with her fingertips. "This will do very well," she said. "Good," he said. "I'll leave you to settle. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry. I'll be out at the corrals until sundown." He was as good as his word. He worked and she settled and explored the kitchen, which was not a catastrophe but was clearly the kitchen of a man eating alone with minimal interest in the process. She found flour and lard and beans and salt pork and dried apples, and by the time the sun was touching the bluffs to the west, she had made cornbread and a proper bean stew, and there was coffee hot on the stove. The two of them ate dinner on opposite sides of a pine table in the kitchen, and they talked about the ranch. He told her what acreage was under cattle, what the water situation was with Stone Creek and the secondary spring on the south pasture, what the bunkhouse held in terms of hands, and what each of them was responsible for. He talked about it with the focused clarity of someone who knows their subject and trusts the person they're explaining it to, which Jane found she liked enormously. She had spent years being explained to as though she might not understand, and here was a man who simply handed her the information as though it were rightfully hers. She told him what she would need to do a proper accounting. A ledger which she had seen in the cabinet in the study, a list of all current transactions and debts and credits, and the invoices from the past 6 months which he had in a cedar box under the desk, and which were, as she had suspected, not in any particular order. "I'll have it organized in 3 days," she said. "I believe you," he said. They drank their coffee and there was a silence that was companionable, the fire in the stove settling, the horses quiet in the barn, the enormous dark quiet of the frontier night pressing gently at the windows. "Mr. Stone," Jane said. "Dexter," he said. "If you're working here, Mr. Stone is going to get tiresome." "Dexter," she said. It settled into the air differently than his surname had. "What made you say what you said this morning, in the land office?" He looked at his coffee cup. "My mother," he said after a moment. "She was traded too. Different circumstances, different era. My grandfather made arrangements for her when she was 17. She spent 30 years married to a man she didn't choose." He paused. "She died when I was 12. I always thought the marriage killed her as surely as the consumption did. Took the spirit out of her a piece at a time." He looked up. "When Percy read that clause about you, I heard it the way I imagined she might have heard her own arrangement being read. I wasn't going to let it stand." Jane held his eyes for a moment. "I'm sorry about your mother," she said. "I'm sorry about this morning," he said, "for how you were treated." "You remedied it," she said. "That matters more than the insult." He nodded. They finished their coffee and the evening settled into ordinary things, banking the fire, the lamp extinguished, the night moving gently toward its middle. Jane lay in her room in the dark and listened to the creak outside her window, the small particular sound of it, water over stones, and she thought about the word freedom, about how she had said it to herself many times in the abstract and how now it was a concrete thing with a shape and a sound, and the shape was this creak, and the sound was exactly this. She slept well for the first time in a week. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Jane found she took to quickly, the way a person who has been working in bad conditions and is suddenly given good tools discovers how much better they actually are at their work than they had been allowed to demonstrate. She organized the accounts and found 3 separate places where the man in town had underbilled for cattle sales, which amounted to $80 in uncollected money. She made a list and presented it to Dexter over breakfast on her 3rd morning. He read through it carefully, then looked up. "You found this in 3 days. It wasn't hidden," she said. "It was just unsorted." "The man in town has been doing this for 2 years, Dexter said. "Then you are owed considerably more than $80, Jane said. "But I only had 3 days of records." He was quiet for a moment and then he smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him do it fully, not the small dry edges of amusement she had seen twice before, but an actual smile, and it changed his face in a way she was not entirely prepared for. "You are considerably more valuable than I advertised when I offered you the position," he said. "People usually are," she said. She wrote the letter to the account man in town herself, at Dexter's direction, and the $80 was recovered within the week, the account man apparently too embarrassed by his errors to dispute them. In the evenings, they developed the habit of sitting on the porch after supper, when the heat had softened and the sky went through its long, careful colors above the western ridgeline. They talked about many things. Books, of which she had read more than he had, but he was not dismissive of the ones she recommended, and she could see him considering them seriously. The politics of the territory, which were complicated in 1878, the cattle business and what the coming years of the railroad would mean for it, the nature of the land and water rights, and the ways the law was and was not useful in settling disputes. She learned about him in pieces, the way you learn about landscape when you are traveling through it rather than looking at a map. He had come to the territory from Missouri when he was 23, with $200 and a very clear idea of what kind of land he wanted, and no idea how to get it. He had worked for other ranchers for 2 years before he had enough saved to start. He had built the main house himself, or mostly himself, with help from his one full-time hand at the time, a man named Ed Prout, who was now his foreman and who Jane had met on her 2nd day, and immediately recognized as someone who had been with Dexter long enough to be thoroughly loyal without being sycophantic. Ed Prout was a compact, weathered man of about 45 with a gray mustache and the particular squint of someone who has spent decades looking into distance. He was not immediately warm to Jane, not hostile either, just watchful in the way of someone who cares about a place and is reserving judgment on changes. Jane respected this and did not try to charm him. She simply did her work with competence and let it speak. The charm happened anyway on day 5, when Ed Prout came into the kitchen during the noon hour with a deep cut on his hand from a piece of fence wire, and sat at the table with it wrapped in his bandana, looking faintly annoyed at himself. Jane cleaned and dressed it without being asked, and without making him feel foolish about it, and they talked about the south pasture fence situation that had produced the injury, and by the time his hand was bandaged, Ed Prout had decided she was all right. She could tell by the way he took the coffee she poured him, and said thank you without any of the formal stiffness of the previous days. It was in the 2nd week that she noticed she was watching Dexter in the mornings when he came in from the early work, when there was still that particular quality of morning light on him that made everything look clear and new. She noticed the way he moved around the kitchen, not intrusive on whatever she was doing but present, filling his coffee cup, and leaning at the counter with the ease of a man in his own space who has stopped being awkward about the addition to that space. She noticed the way he spoke to his hands, with the directness of fair authority, clear about what he wanted without making the wanting feel punishing. She noticed that he sometimes watched her too, in the same way, the quick natural look, and then the look away that happens when you are trying not to be observed noticing. She catalogued these observations without making anything of them, because her situation was specific, and her need was practical, and she was not in the habit of letting herself want things that could complicate the stable ground she had found. But the frontier nights were long, and the conversations on the porch were easy, and the stars above Coldwater Creek country were obscenely numerous, and a person can only tell themselves so many times that they are not feeling what they are clearly feeling. The first real complication came 3 weeks into her time at Stone Creek, in the form of her father. Thomas Leland rode onto the property on a Tuesday afternoon when Dexter was up at the north boundary checking a water line, and Jane was in the kitchen making bread. She heard the horse and came to the door, and there he was, looking older than she remembered him, which was only 3 weeks, but he had carried these 3 weeks visibly. He sat his horse and looked at her with the complicated face of a man who has been rehearsing something. "Jane," he said. "Father," she said. He came down from the horse, and she stood in the doorway rather than inviting him in, not from cruelty but from a need to be clear about something. This was not her home to invite him into, but more than that, she needed him to know that she was standing on her own ground now and he was coming to her. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Yes," she agreed. She did not make it easier for him, but she waited. "What I did was wrong," he said. "I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I did it anyway. I told myself I was providing for you. I told myself Stone was a decent man and would treat you well." He paused. "I was using you to solve my problem and calling it something else." Jane looked at him. The bread dough needed another 10 minutes, but she left it. "Why did you come?" she asked. "To apologize," he said, "and to tell you the water rights are holding. Stone's man from town delivered the paperwork last week. The ranch is going to be all right." He looked down at his hat. "I wanted you to know that what you endured was not for nothing." "What I endured," Jane said carefully, "did not save the ranch, Father. What Dexter Stone chose to do saved the ranch. I endured it, and then a man I had never met decided it was wrong and corrected it." She paused. "Which is more than the man who raised me did." Thomas Leland looked up, and his eyes were wet, and she felt the old complicated tangle of love and anger and grief that is the inheritance of a child with an imperfect parent who is not entirely bad. "I know," he said. "I know it." She stepped down from the doorway and crossed the yard, and she put her hand briefly on his arm. "I forgive you," she said. "Not because it was acceptable, because I don't want to carry it." She removed her hand. "But I'm not coming back, Father. This is a good situation. I am useful here, and I am paid fairly, and I am free. I'll visit, but this is where I'm living." He nodded, and she could see him accepting it with the particular grief of a man who has gotten what he deserved. She sent him off with a parcel of the bread when it was finished and stood on the porch and watched the dust his horse made on the road, and when she turned around, Dexter was standing at the barn door. He had come back from the north boundary without her hearing him, and she was not sure how long he had been there. "I heard some of it," he said. "I wasn't trying to. I was going to make noise at the barn, but I didn't want to interrupt." Jane considered this. "It's all right," she said. "It needed saying." "You were generous with him," Dexter said. "More generous than I might have been." "He's not a bad man," Jane said. "He's a man who made a bad choice. The difference matters." Dexter looked at her for a moment with the particular look she was beginning to know, the one that was somehow both assessing and warm, the look of someone who keeps discovering they are more impressed than they expected to be. "It does," he said. "It matters a great deal." They stood there in the afternoon for a moment that stretched slightly longer than utility required, and then Jane said she needed to go finish making supper, and Dexter said he needed to check the horses, and they separated to their respective purposes with a care that was itself a kind of communication. October arrived by degrees, the mornings getting their edge back, the cottonwoods along Stone Creek going gold in long burning sequences that Jane watched from her bedroom window with a feeling she could only call happiness. The word surprised her when she identified it. She had been comfortable before, in good stretches of her life, and she had been useful, but this combination of freedom and usefulness and beauty was something she had not had access to before, and it had the specific quality of happiness. She was also, without meaning to and somewhat helplessly, falling in love with Dexter Stone. She was not doing it dramatically or suddenly. It was more like the way the cottonwoods turned, one leaf at a time, and you looked up on a certain morning and the whole tree was gold, and you could not have said exactly when the last green thing had changed. There had been the morning he came in from the early round, and stopped to look at the sky for a moment through the kitchen window with a face full of quiet appreciation, unguarded, and she had felt something shift under her ribs. There had been an afternoon when a horse in the far corral cut its leg on the fence, and she had gone out to help, and he had let her help without hesitation, had talked to her through the whole process of cleaning and dressing the injury with the easy equality of someone who does not believe in unnecessary hierarchies. And she had thought, with a clarity that was startling, that she had never known a man who made her feel so completely capable. There had been an evening on the porch when she had been reading aloud from a book of natural philosophy she had found in his study, and she had looked up mid-sentence to find him watching her with an expression so unguarded and warm that she had lost her place on the page entirely. And he had said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, keep reading." And his voice had had something in it that was not apology at all, but was something more careful and more dangerous than that. She kept the feelings to herself with the iron discipline of a woman who has learned to be careful about wanting things. Her situation was good, and she did not want to endanger it through imprudence. Dexter Stone had been nothing but honorable, and she would not misread his decency for something it might not be and create an awkwardness that would destroy the thing she had built here. She was keeping this careful account of herself when, on the 3rd of October, a man named Howard Greele rode onto Stone Creek Ranch. Howard Greele was a land broker, which in 1878 Arizona Territory meant a man who moved between the spaces where law was still finding its footing and made his money in those gaps. He was not quite criminal, not fully legitimate, the way a shadow is not quite darkness and not quite light. He was connected to a larger cattle interest based in Texas called the Harrow Combine that was moving through the territory buying up water rights and smaller operations, consolidating them into vast holdings that answered to no local authority. He was also, it emerged within the first 10 minutes of his arriving on the porch, known to Dexter. Jane watched from the kitchen window as the two men stood on the porch and talked, or rather as Howard Greele talked with the oiled ease of a man who has made many offers and had them accepted, and Dexter stood listening with his arms crossed, and a face that had gone to the quality of stone the word in his name implied. She brought coffee out, not because they had asked for it, but because the errand gave her a reason to be close enough to hear. Greele barely acknowledged her. He was speaking about the Harrow Combine's interest in Stone Creek, about the offer they were prepared to make, about the particular advantage of the position Stone Creek occupied relative to the water source, and the rail line that was coming within 18 months and would make the territory a different kind of place entirely. "The offer is $12,000, Greele said. "It is a significant offer, Mr. Stone, more than the land is worth at current valuation." "I know what the land is worth," Dexter said. "And I know why the Combine wants it. Consolidation is the future. Consolidation is the Combine making itself rich at the expense of every small operator in the territory," Dexter said. "I've watched what they've done in New Mexico. I know what their consolidation looks like on the ground." Greele smiled with the patience of a man who has heard objections before and classified them as obstacles with solutions. "You're a single operator, Mr. Stone. The rail changes everything." You won't be able to compete at the scale the market will demand. I'll determine what I can and cannot do, Dexter said. The answer is no. Greal glanced at Jane, finally, with the dismissive survey of a man cataloging furnishings. Perhaps you'd like to think about it. Discuss it with those in your household. Something in the way he said those in your household, the particular inflation of suggestion he put into it, made Jane set the coffee tray down on the porch railing with more precision than the moment required. "Mr. Greal," she said, "if you're implying that the answer might change with more consultation, you should know that I am an employee of this ranch, not a proprietor, and more relevantly that Mr. Stone is not the kind of man who says no, and then changes his answer because someone gave him time to reconsider." She met the man's small, bright eyes directly. "The answer is no. If the Combine sends someone else, the answer will still be no." Greal looked at her for a moment with something that recalibrated from dismissal to a more careful assessment. "Well," he said. "Good afternoon," Jane said. Greal took his coffee cup back from where he'd set it, drank the rest of it with the deliberate pace of a man not to be hurried, set it down, and went to his horse. He mounted, touched his hat in a way that was not quite respectful, and rode back down the road. Dexter watched him go and then turned to Jane. He was looking at her with the unguarded expression again, the one that made her lose her page. "Thank you," he said. "He was wasting your time," she said. "He was," Dexter agreed. He paused. "You said I don't change my answer because someone gives me time to reconsider." "You don't," she said. "I've been watching." "You're right," he said. "I don't." He picked up his own coffee cup and then set it down again without drinking from it. Jane, the way he said her name was different from the usual way. It had a weight to it, a specificity, the way a word has different meaning when it is being used and not just spoken. "Dexter," she said, with the same weight. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked out at the land, at the creek line and the gold cottonwoods and the long afternoon shadows coming across the pasture. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to say it honestly because I think you deserve honesty more than you've often gotten it." "All right," she said. "When I came to the land office that morning," he said, "I was not expecting to feel anything in particular. I was expecting a land transaction, and I found something that made me angry on your behalf, and I acted on that anger because it was the right thing to do." He paused. "But in the past month, working here, talking with you every day, I have found that what I feel is considerably more than the anger of a man who witnessed an injustice." He turned back to look at her, and his dark gray eyes were very direct. "I think about you. I think about what you'll say about a thing. I think about the way you look when you're reading, and the way you look when you're working through a problem, and the way you look in the evenings on the porch." He stopped. "I'm not saying this to create pressure of any kind. You are here in your own right, and your position is secure regardless of what you say to me. But I would rather you know it and have the choice of what to do with it than not know it and have that choice taken from you." The corners of his mouth moved slightly. "You've had enough choices taken from you." Jane stood with the September wind, or actually the October wind, gentle and carrying the smell of cottonwood gold, moving through the air between them. She thought about iron discipline and about practicality, and about the account she had been keeping of herself. And then she thought about his face when he stood in the land office and said, "She goes where she chooses." "I have been trying very hard," she said slowly, "not to feel what I also feel." She looked at him with the steadiness that was her signature. "Because I was afraid of being wrong about it, and because I was afraid of endangering something that has given me back my sense of myself." She paused. "But I think the only way to be honest with a man who has been honest with me is to be honest." She looked at him fully. "I think about you too," she said. "Quite a lot." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the way a held breath is full. He crossed the porch in 2 steps, and then stopped at a distance from her that was close but not presumptuous, a distance that asked a question rather than answered one. And she answered it by closing the remaining space herself. And then his hand was at her face, and she put hers against his chest. And the kiss was quiet and genuine, and tasted of coffee and October air, and every morning of the past month that had been secretly building toward this one. When they separated, they were both rather still for a moment. The way you are after something you have been anticipating for a long time actually arrives. "Well," she said, which was quite possibly the least eloquent thing she had ever said. "Yes," he agreed, which was not much better. They stood there on the porch of Stone Creek Ranch with the golden afternoon surrounding them, and looked at each other with the soft, stunned happiness of two people who have both arrived at the same place from difficult roads, and find it is exactly as good as they had hoped. They did not rush toward anything. This was itself a kind of luxury that neither of them had been given much of, and they were both old enough in their ways to appreciate it. He courted her with the deliberate care of a man who understands that courtship is a form of saying that what you want is worth waiting for properly. He brought her wildflowers once, the small pale ones that grew along the creek bank, not with grand gesture but with the offhand simplicity of someone who passed them on his way in and thought she might like them. She did like them. She put them in a glass on the kitchen windowsill and looked at them while she was working and felt something warm move through her. They rode together on Saturday afternoons, ranging out across the open country around Stone Creek with an ease that felt entirely natural, her seat on horseback being considerably more accomplished than he had expected, which he told her, and she told him that she had been riding since she was 4 and he should not look so surprised. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm admiring." She looked at him from the back of the gray mare she had taken a liking to. "Those are different things." "Not always," he said. In November, Howard Greele returned, this time not alone. He had 2 men with him, not the kind of men you brought for a conversation. They were big men, quiet in the particular way of men who are being paid for implied menace. They came at dusk when the light was low, and they caught Dexter outside the barn. Jane had seen them from the kitchen window and her stomach had done something cold. She had gone immediately to the desk in the study where Dexter kept the Winchester, and she had taken it down and checked it with hands that were steady because she was not going to be anything other than steady, and she had come out to the porch. Greele was making his offer again, and the men behind him were standing in a formation that was not accidental. "The Combine's patience has limits," Greele was saying. 12,000 is generous. I've been asked to communicate that the offer will not be extended indefinitely." "Then stop extending it," Dexter said. Jane stepped off the porch with the Winchester carried easily in the crook of her arm, not aimed at anyone but present, which was its own communication. Greele looked at her. The 2 large men looked at her. She looked back at all 3 of them with the clear-eyed steadiness that was her signature. "Mr. Greele," she said, "you have made your offer on 2 occasions and received the same answer on 2 occasions. The answer is still no. If you send men here with the intention of making the refusal feel unwise, I want you to understand that this property has been in Dexter Stone's hands for 6 years, and it will remain in his hands. And whatever the Harrow Combine imagines its options are, those options do not include intimidating the people here." She was aware, in a corner of her attention, that Ed Pruitt had appeared at the bunkhouse door with the relaxed bearing of someone who is not where he is by accident. Greele looked at the Winchester, and then at Ed Pruitt, and then at Dexter, who had not moved and had not lost the quality of complete calm. "Territory is changing," Greele said, and there was a harder note under the broker's smoothness now, the sound of genuine threat. "The territory changes every year," Dexter said, "but this land is mine and it stays mine. Take that back to the Combine." Greele nodded once slowly, a gesture that contained its own kind of threat. He wheeled his horse and the 2 large men wheeled with him, and they rode out of Stone Creek in the low light of early evening. Jane let the breath out of her lungs in a long, slow release. Dexter came to her and took the Winchester gently from her hands and set it against the porch post, and then he took her hands, which were steady and had been steady the whole time, and held them. "Thank you," he said, the same 2 words as before, but this time carrying considerably more than thanks. "I was not going to let them frighten you off your own land," she said. "They didn't frighten me," he said. "I know," she said. "I wasn't going to let them try either." He looked at her for a moment, holding her hands in the cooling evening air, and then he said, very quietly, "Jane, I would like to ask you something, and I need you to know that before you answer. Your answer does not change a single thing about your position here, your safety here, or my opinion of you. This is a question with a true free answer." Jane looked up at him. "Ask it," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not as any kind of arrangement or settlement or practical consolidation, because I love you. Because I have been falling in love with you since you sat down on that bench outside the land office and told me you were deciding. Because you are the most honest and capable and remarkable woman I have ever had the privilege of knowing." He paused. "Because when I think about this land and this life, I cannot any more think about them without thinking about you in them." The evening was fully settled around them, the first stars coming up over the eastern ridgeline, the creek speaking its low, steady language somewhere in the dark. Jane Leland thought about a morning in September when she had stood in a land office and been offered as the closing condition of a transaction. She thought about what she had cost in that accounting and what it had done to her to be assigned that kind of value. She thought about a man who had walked into that office and refused to be party to it, who had given up $2,000 and a parcel of land and said, "She goes where she chooses." She chose. "Yes," she said, "because I love you, because you gave me back to myself before you gave me anything else, and that is the thing I will never stop being grateful for, and also because you are the most genuinely good man I have ever met, and I want to be beside you for all of it." He smiled then, fully and completely, and it was even better than the first time she had seen it. And she laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh, clean and happy, and he pulled her close and she let herself be held, and they stood there in the dark of the frontier night while the creek moved over its stones and the stars multiplied above the ridgeline, and the horses made their quiet sounds in the barn. Ed Prout, coming around the corner of the barn with a studiously casual air, turned and went back the way he came without being noticed, smiling into his mustache. They were married on the 12th of November, 1878, in Coldwater Creek. It was not an elaborate ceremony. The minister was a traveling man named Reverend Clay, who came through the territory on a circuit, and who had the practical warmth of someone who has performed frontier weddings in very different settings and knows that what matters is the intention, not the decoration. Thomas Leland was there. He had not been initially on the list of those Jane intended to invite, but in the end she had written him a letter, not because the past was erased, because it was not and she was not pretending it was, but because she was beginning a new part of her life, and she wanted to begin it without the weight of unresolved things dragging at the edges. Her father arrived early to the church and sat in the front pew with his hat on his knees, and stood when she came through the door on Ed Prout's arm, Ed having been asked to perform this function with the genuine gruffness of a man who is moved and trying not to show it. Thomas Leland looked at his daughter in her good dress with her dark hair pinned up and the small bunch of late-season flowers she carried, and his eyes went wet again, as they had in the yard of Stone Creek Ranch. And this time Jane met his eyes and gave him a small nod that said she saw him there. She was glad he had come, and the complicated thing between them was not finished, but it was not going to prevent this day from being what it was. Dexter Stone stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which was dark blue wool and had clearly been made by someone who knew what they were doing. And when Jane came through the door and their eyes met across the space of the room, he looked at her with an expression that she knew she would be able to close her eyes and see for the rest of her life. Reverend Clay spoke the words, and they spoke theirs, and it was done. The reception was at the hotel in Coldwater Creek, which in 1878 was a long room with a board floor that could be cleared for dancing. And Clara Ashworth from the dry goods store had organized a group of women who had made enough food to feed the territory. And a man named Archero played fiddle with a speed and joy that made even Ed Prout eventually be persuaded onto the floor by Clara Ashworth, who was considerably more determined than he was. Thomas Leland drank 2 glasses of whiskey and talked to Dexter for a while, and Jane watched them from across the room with the measuring eye of a woman who is trying to determine whether she needs to intervene, and then decided she did not, because Dexter had the look of a man holding his own with entirely equal ground and her father had the look of a man trying to do something right. She danced with her husband 3 times that evening, which in 1878 was itself a declaration, and the 3rd time was a slow waltz when Archero had tired slightly and was playing more gently, and Dexter held her close with the particular care of someone who knows the value of what they are holding, and Jane rested her cheek against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him and thought, simply and completely, this is home. The Harrow Combine did not disappear because Dexter said no. In the months that followed, they made life uncomfortable for a number of smaller ranchers in the territory, and 2 of the operations near Stone Creek sold their water rights under pressure, which tightened the landscape. Dexter and Ed Prout spent a considerable amount of the winter working through the legal implications and talking with other ranchers who were resisting, and Jane used her accounting skills to help 3 neighboring operations get their books in order well enough to make the Combine's pressure less effective. She did this without being asked, or rather she was asked by the wife of a rancher named Bowman who came to her at church one Sunday and said she had heard Jane Leland, which was now Jane Stone, was good with numbers and could she help, and Jane had said yes immediately and then told Dexter about it over supper. "Of course," he said, without a moment's hesitation. "It might take time I should be spending on our accounts," she said. "Our accounts are in excellent order," he said. "And if helping the Bowmans and the others helps the whole territory resist the Combine's consolidation, that benefits us as directly as it benefits them." He paused. "Besides which, it's the right thing to do." She looked at him across the supper table and felt that shift under her ribs again, the one that had started in October and had not stopped. By spring of 1879, she had helped 4 neighboring operations get their financial documentation in shape well enough to negotiate from strength rather than desperation, and the Harrow Combine's advance through that part of the territory had effectively stalled. Howard Greele had not returned to Stone Creek, which was a fact Jane noted with satisfaction. The land took on its spring colors, the grass coming back, the creek running higher with the snowmelt from the northern mountains, the air carrying the particular freshness of the desert country waking up after winter. Jane walked the property in the mornings with a cup of coffee and thought about what she wanted to plant in the kitchen garden, and Dexter walked with her sometimes, not talking, just present, and the parallel privacy of 2 people who have learned to be alone together was itself a kind of intimacy she had not known to value until she had it. In March she told him she was expecting a child. They were on the porch the morning of it, the early spring light clean and new, and she said the words and watched his face do something she had not seen before, a movement of pure feeling that was neither joy nor tears but the face of joy that is so full it cannot hold itself completely still. He crossed to her and took her face in his hands the way he had the first time they kissed, and he looked at her for a long moment and then simply said, "Good," in a voice that was not simple at all. He said it like a man who has been given something he did not allow himself to believe he might have, and she put her hands over his and felt his warmth, and the morning was absolutely perfect. The pregnancy was her first, and she had no one close to ask about it for a while, and then Clara Ashworth became a resource of tremendous practical value, a woman who had borne 3 children on the frontier and had strong opinions about most things including childbirth and shared them freely and with zero apology. Dora, who had worked for her father, came to visit twice during the spring and summer and brought herbs and knowledge that she gave to Jane with the matter-of-fact practicality of a woman who trusts another woman's ability to receive information. Thomas Leland came to Stone Creek in April, a visit that was arranged with a letter exchange that was itself a kind of negotiation, each of them learning the shape of the thing between them. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and looked at the house with the eyes of a man taking inventory of his daughter's life and finding it, to his obvious relief, genuinely good. He did not say much. He did not need to. Jane understood that the visit itself was the apology continuing, being expressed through presence rather than words. When he left, she walked him to his horse and he embraced her, stiffly at first and then with the old warmth that she remembered from childhood, before the debts and the desperation had worn the tenderness down. "He's a good man," Thomas said, meaning Dexter. "I know," Jane said. "Better than I deserved to give you," Thomas said. "He didn't come from you," Jane said gently. "He came from his own choices, same as I came from mine." Her father looked at her for a moment. "You got your backbone from your mother," he said, "and there was love in it." "I got it from having to use it," Jane said, "and there was forgiveness in that." He rode away and she stood in the yard with the April sun on her face and felt the peculiar grace of having something complicated and painful become, if not simple, at least bearable, at least honest, at least clean. November came again with the first early cold, and on a Tuesday morning with frost on the grass and the creek running quiet and the sky the pale blue of deep cold, Jane Stone gave birth to a son. The labor was long and the midwife, a woman named Mrs. Harger who drove out from Coldwater Creek, was competent and brisk and left Jane no time to be frightened by keeping her firmly occupied. Dexter sat outside the bedroom door for most of 7 hours, and when Mrs. Harger finally opened the door and told him he could come in, he walked into the room with the careful steps of a man moving through something precious and fragile, and Jane was lying in the bed with a face full of exhaustion and something else, the deepest warmth Jane Stone, previously Jane Leland, had ever worn, and she held up the small wrapped bundle for him to see. The baby was red and small, and had a quantity of dark hair, and was making a sound somewhere between complaint and curiosity. Dexter sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and Jane watched his face do the full-feeling thing again, bigger this time, larger than any face can comfortably contain, and she felt her own eyes fill for the first time since the morning in the land office when she had refused to cry. "Hello," Dexter said to the baby quietly, as though they had met somewhere before and he was glad to see him again. "I was thinking William," Jane said. "William Thomas Stone." Dexter looked at her. The middle name carried the weight she knew it carried. "Thomas," he said. "He is my father," Jane said. "He did wrong and he has tried since to be better. I'd like to give him something." Dexter reached over and took her free hand and held it. "William Thomas Stone," he said. "Yes," she said. William Thomas Stone was, from the first week, a clear-eyed and observant child with his father's quality of stillness and his mother's tendency to take direct inventory of whatever was in front of him. He held Dexter's finger with the grip of someone entirely serious about the endeavor, and looked up at the two faces above him, with the apparent satisfaction of someone who has arrived at the correct destination. Ed Prout, coming to the kitchen door on William's third day of life, and finding the baby in Jane's arms while Dexter sat at the table with coffee and a face of profound contentment, said, "Well," cleared his throat, and gave a small wrapped package which turned out to be a carved wooden horse that he had made himself, and which he had made with considerable more artistry than anyone who knew him strictly as a ranch foreman would have expected. Jane thanked him with the full warmth she had for him by then, which was considerable. Thomas Leland rode out when William was 2 weeks old and sat in the kitchen with his grandson in his arms, and did not attempt to speak for a while, which was the most honest thing Jane had ever seen her father do. He stayed for 2 days, sleeping in the bunkhouse at Ed's invitation, and he and Dexter talked a great deal about cattle and water and the railroad, and there was between them by the end of those 2 days the beginning of something that Jane would not have called friendship yet, but which had the shape of the beginning of friendship, and she thought that was enough. William learned to walk on the wooden floors of Stone Creek's main house in the spring of 1880, and his first word, to the considerable amusement of Ed Prout and the undisguised delight of his parents, was horse, delivered with great conviction while pointing at the corral from the porch. His second word was more, which he applied with equal conviction to cornbread, to being read to, and to being carried. Jane had continued her bookkeeping work for the neighboring ranchers through the previous year, and by 1880 she had formalized it in a small way, not a business exactly, but a recognized service. She kept accounts for 6 operations in the valley and was paid fairly for it, and the money went into a separate account she kept in her own name at the bank in Coldwater Creek, which Dexter had suggested and insisted upon. "Your earnings are yours," he had said, when she had asked why he thought it mattered. "We are partners in this life, but the work you do independently of the ranch should be credited to you independently. You should always have something that is yours alone." She had looked at him with the clear-eyed directness of a woman who recognizes the significance of being seen. "You are extraordinary," she said. "I am sensible," he said, which is less romantic but more useful. She kissed him for that, which he received as the compliment it was. The Harrow Combine eventually directed its attention toward the northern part of the territory, where resistance was less organized, and the valley around Coldwater Creek maintained its collection of independent operations with a solidarity that Jane's bookkeeping had helped make possible. She would not have called herself responsible for that, and she did not, but she understood that she had been part of it, and that was a different kind of satisfaction than she had expected to find when she walked out of that land office on a September morning with $4.30 and the beginning of herself. The summer of 1881 was hot and long, and the creek ran lower than usual, which meant tighter management of the grazing rotation, and Dexter worked long hours in the heat that made him come home in the evenings with the particular exhaustion of a man who has given everything to the day. Jane made sure the evenings were good. Good food, the porch, the cooler air coming off the mesa after sundown, William asleep with the uncomplicated depth of small children, the conversation that had been the foundation of everything they were to each other still easy and real after 3 years. She was expecting again by October, which she told him on the porch in the evening and which produced the same full-face response it always did, that movement of feeling that was too large for regular containment. "Is it terrifying?" she asked him once, watching him watch the stars with William asleep in his lap, "to have this much that you care about?" He turned his head and looked at her. "Every day," he said, "and I wouldn't give it up for anything." Their second child was born in June of 1882, a girl with Jane's dark hair and Dexter's gray eyes, who announced herself with considerably more volume than William had, and who demonstrated within her first week a personality of such decisive force that Mrs. Harger said she had never seen a child so clear about what she wanted. They named her Caroline Ruth Stone, the middle name for Dexter's mother, which he had suggested himself in the quiet evening after Caroline was born, and Jane had agreed without hesitation. William, at 2.5, regarded his sister with the careful assessment of someone who is gathering information before committing to an opinion. His opinion, delivered approximately 3 days in, was that she was loud but interesting, which Jane privately thought was one of the finest introductions anyone had ever given Caroline Stone. Thomas Leland became, in these years, something his daughter had not entirely expected him to become. The partial redemption she had offered him in the year of her marriage had given him something to grow toward, and he had grown. He came to Stone Creek frequently enough to know William's favorite games and Caroline's particular expressions, and he brought small gifts that demonstrated he was paying attention. A set of wooden alphabet blocks for William, a soft quilted blanket in Caroline's favorite yellow for her 2nd birthday. He and Dexter had arrived, gradually and without formal declaration, at genuine friendship, built on the practical common ground of men who work the same kind of land and face the same kind of challenges, and have learned to value honesty over performance. Jane watched this friendship with a feeling she had not expected, which was gratitude. Not for herself, or not only for herself, but for William and Caroline, who would grow up knowing their grandfather as a man who tried to be better, which was a more valuable lesson than many. Ed Prout married a widow named Agnes from Coldwater Creek in the fall of 1882, a development that surprised everyone except Jane, who had watched the two of them at the church social the previous spring with the quiet eye of someone who knows the signs. Agnes Prout was a tall, solid woman with considerable competence and a clear set of opinions that she expressed without apology, and she and Ed fit together with the easy precision of two people who have been looking, without fully admitting it, for someone like the other. Agnes came to Stone Creek for Sunday dinner most weeks, and she and Jane became friends of the particular and sustaining kind that grows between women who recognize each other's quality. They talked about their children, Agnes's son from her first marriage, a boy of 12 named Carl, about the accounts Jane was keeping, and the new families moving into the valley and what that would mean for the community, about books, about the particular challenges and satisfactions of living in country that was simultaneously beautiful and demanding. Caroline Stone grew into herself with the energy of something entirely determined to take up exactly as much space as she needed. At 3, she had opinions about everything and expressed them with the full force of her personality, which her parents found alternately exhausting and magnificent. Dexter, who might have struggled with this given the frontier norms of what little girls were supposed to be, instead watched his daughter with the same clear appreciation he brought to everything he valued. He did not try to quiet her. He asked her questions and listened to the answers with genuine interest, and Jane loved him for it with a depth that kept expanding like the country around them. William, at 4.5, had decided he wanted to work with horses, a decision arrived at with the same quiet certainty that characterized everything he did. He followed Ed Prout around the barn with the focused dedication of an apprentice, and Ed, who had no children of his own and had not known he wanted any, took to the boy with a gruff tenderness that was entirely his own. In the fall of 1883, Jane was at her desk in the study, working through the Bowman accounts, when Dexter came in from the morning round and set a letter on the desk beside her. It had come from a law firm in Coldwater Creek. She picked it up and read it and then read it again. The letter was from an attorney representing the estate of a woman named Margaret Hollies, who had been Percy the land agent's wife and who had died in August. Margaret Hollies had kept a private diary, and in it she had written, at length and with considerable clarity, about the practices of Percy Hollies and his arrangement with certain larger interests, including the Harrow Combine, that had made his role as land agent considerably more profitable and considerably more corrupt than it was supposed to be. The diary had been left to the attorney, with instructions to use it as the attorney saw fit, which the attorney had understood as permission to provide it to relevant parties. Among the things described in the diary was the land meeting of September 1878, and the terms that had been added to the contract on behalf of the Combine's interest in having Dexter Stone's water rights and access, an interest they had hoped to facilitate by creating a personal connection through an arranged marriage. Jane Leland had not been offered as her father's idea, or not only her father's idea. The suggestion of the marriage clause had come from Percy Hollies, on behalf of a quiet Combine interest that believed Dexter Stone might be more amenable to later negotiation if he had a financial and personal stake that could be leveraged. Jane set the letter down on the desk. Dexter was watching her from the doorway. They were never just after the land, she said. No, he said, he had read it already. They were trying to set up a future leverage point. If you were here as part of an arrangement, they thought they could use that arrangement against me later. Jane absorbed this for a moment. And instead, she said, with a careful quiet in her voice, you refused the arrangement and I came here freely. And instead, Dexter said, everything they tried to set up turned into the opposite of what they intended. She looked at him across the study, this room that had become as familiar to her as any room she had ever been in, with its cedar box of invoices now completely organized, its shelves with the books they had both read, the desk that she had first touched with her fingertips on the day she arrived, and thought it was put there by someone who imagined the person in this room might want to write things down. "The lamp on that desk," she said. "I always thought you put it there for whoever used this room." "I put it there for you," he said, "or I put it there for someone. When I was building this house, I thought about who I wanted to live in it, and whoever that person was, I thought they would want a light to work by." Jane looked at him and felt the vast and ordinary miracle of being in the exactly right life with the exactly right person, a thing that had not been given to her, had not been arranged for her, had been refused on her behalf and then found by her own choosing. "Come here," she said. He came to her and she stood from the desk and took his hands, the way he had taken hers on the porch that November evening after Howard Greele rode away. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I tell you that I love you every day. But I want to say it in full, for the record, in all its particulars." She held his eyes with hers. "You gave me back to myself. Before you gave me anything else, before the work and the wage and the room and the courtship and this life, you gave me back to myself on a September morning when you could simply have accepted an arrangement that benefited you and no one was going to stop you." She paused. "I would have made a life regardless. I believe I would have found my own way. But I found you, and I found myself through the finding of you, and I am grateful for every single day of the particular life we have made." She smiled, and it was the smile she reserved for him, the one with everything in it. "That is the full accounting." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I want to be worthy of that accounting every day for the rest of my life." "You are," she said. "You have been." The attorney's letter eventually contributed to a larger inquiry into Percy Hollis's conduct, which resulted in his removal from the land agent position and some degree of accountability for the combine interests he had served. Though the law in 1883 Arizona Territory moved slowly and incompletely, as it did everywhere on the frontier. The inquiry uncovered several other arrangements that bore the same fingerprints as the land meeting of 1878, other people's lives that had been traded and negotiated without their knowledge or consent. Jane provided a written account when asked, clearly and fully, and it was one of the more satisfying things she had done with her clarity and her directness. The railroad came through the valley in 1884, as Howard Greele had predicted, and it changed things, as he had predicted it would. But it did not change them the way the combine had intended. The small operators who had organized and maintained their independence through the preceding years were able to negotiate collectively with the railroad representatives, and the terms they obtained were considerably better than those available to isolated individual ranchers. Stone Creek expanded its operation to meet the new market, with 2 additional pastures purchased legally at full price and 2 new hands hired from among the men who came to the territory with the railroad construction and stayed when they saw the country. Jane's accounting work became more formally a business in the mid-1880s, when several of the valley's merchants asked for her help in addition to the ranch operators, and she took on a desk in the Coldwater Creek building that housed the newspaper, a room of her own that smelled of ink and wood and the adjacent press, which she found she liked. She went there on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, leaving the children with Agnes Prout, who was endlessly good about it and who Jane suspected enjoyed the children as much as her own children. William Stone grew tall and quiet in the way of his father, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's steadiness, and by the time he was 7, he could handle a horse with a confidence that made Ed Prout's chest visibly expand with pride. Caroline Stone grew with the force and directness that had announced itself in her first week of life and showed no signs of moderating, which suited her parents entirely. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's way of looking directly at whatever she was looking at, and she had an absolute certainty about her own opinions that the frontier, which asked certain compliance from its women, was going to find challenging, and which Dexter and Jane had privately agreed they were going to do everything in their power to protect. In the autumn of 1885, Jane was sitting on the porch in the evening when William came and sat beside her. He was 7 3/4, which he measured precisely. The fall was warm still, the way it sometimes was in Arizona territory, the air holding the memory of summer while the cottonwoods turned their gold along the creek. "Mama," he said, "how did you come here?" Jane looked at her son and considered the question with the full seriousness she gave to his full serious questions. "That is a considerable story," she said. "I want to hear it," he said. "Some of it," she said, "you're old enough to hear now. Some of it can wait until you're older." She looked out at the creek. "I came here in September about 7 years ago. Your grandfather owed your father money, and your grandfather decided he would solve his debt by offering me as part of the settlement. It was wrong. It was the wrong thing to do." William was quiet, processing. "What happened?" "Your father refused," Jane said. "He stood in the land office and said that your grandfather's debt was forgiven and the land was settled and I was free to go where I chose." She paused. "And I chose here." William looked at her and then out at the land with his father's quality of looking. "He gave up a lot," he said. "He did," Jane said. "Did he know he'd fall in love with you?" Jane smiled. "No," she said. "He had never met me. He did it because it was right, not because he expected anything from it." William thought about this. "That's the best kind of right," he said, with the particular gravity of a 7-year-old who has arrived at a conclusion that matters. "It is," Jane said. "Remember that." She heard the boot sound behind her and turned, and Dexter was in the doorway, having come from inside, and from his face she knew he had heard. He came out and sat on her other side, and William was between them, and the porch held the three of them with the evening country spread before them, the creek, the golden trees, the big country going blue and dark toward the far ridgeline. "Good answer," Dexter said quietly to her, past the top of William's head. "I had a good subject," she said. Caroline appeared at the door with the face of someone who has been listening from inside and has decided that outside is better. She was 3 years old, and she climbed into her father's lap without asking, and he put his arms around her. And they sat on the porch in the cooling evening and watched the last light leave the western sky. The light went by degrees, the way light always does on the frontier, the orange pulling away from the ridgeline and the blue deepening, and the stars beginning their familiar arrangement. The one she had watched from this porch through 7 years of evenings, through the early nights of wondering and the later nights of belonging, through the great and ordinary business of building a life that was entirely and freely chosen. Jane Stone looked at her family in the deepening dark and thought about the word home, which she had not been able to say with certainty for most of her 22 years, and which now applied to every corner of the specific and beloved world around her. The creek moved over its stones. The horses were quiet in the barn. The stars were very numerous. The night was perfectly still. Inside the house, on the kitchen windowsill, she still kept a glass for wildflowers when they were in season, and Dexter still brought them when he passed the creek bank and thought she might like them, and she always did, and that small continued thing said as much as anything else she could have named about what they were to each other and the life they had made together. Freely and fully and without arrangement or settlement or anything, except the honest and complete choice of two people who had been given something true, and had had the wisdom and the courage to hold on to it. The autumn evening settled fully into night around Stone Creek Ranch, and the stars above the Arizona territory were limitless and bright, and Dexter Stone put his free hand out and Jane Stone took it, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying, and the night went on the way nights do when the people in them are exactly where they are supposed to be, deeply and quietly at peace with the particular life they have been given the grace and the freedom to choose.